architect. Vishaan Chakrabarti is the William W. Worcester Dean of the College of Environmental Design at the University of California, Berkeley, and also as the founder and creative director of Practice for Architecture and Urbanism, which is, we said POW, right? And which is based in New York City. He has done quite a few both scholarly academic work, including in Outer Mongolia and urban dwellings. And I think that's interesting, something to think about. I doubt most of us think about urbanism in Outer Mongolia. To helping to rebuild Manhattan after 9/11. He has an upcoming book. He has a 2013 book, which was what brought him to my radar, called A Country of Cities, a Manifesto for Urban America, which came out in 2013. And he has forthcoming in 2022, a book which shares the title of tonight's talk, The Architecture of Urbanity, Designing Our Future for Pluralism and Planet. Now, Vishaan Chakrabarti may be of particular interest to those who are joining us tonight because he and his firm are building the first towers in Schuylkill Yards. And he shared with us that he has learned how to pronounce that correctly, as all of us who are not native to Philadelphia have a challenge learning to do when we first arrived. So I'm sure you may have made lots of questions, not only about his work at large, but also about the Schuylkill Yards and their plans there. I want to turn it over now to Vishaan Chakrabarti, ask you to join me in virtually welcoming him to our lectern tonight. Welcome.
Beth, thanks so much. Tess, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. And yes, I did learn how to pronounce Schuylkill, and it took a while, but I'm not sure if I can spell it, but I can say it at least. So thanks for joining. I'm going to share my screen, which always takes a second to switch over. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. So as Beth mentioned, the talk tonight is The Architecture of Urbanity, Designing Cities for Pluralism and Planet. I think because climate change and the way in which we deal with culture, race, and equity, I think are some of the central challenges of our time. And it's something I spend a great deal of time thinking about and writing about, both from my perch here at Berkeley as well as on our practice at POW. And so Beth asked you this question as a kind of appetizer, which is, how will cities recover from the pandemic? And I get this question almost daily. And, the answer, as it turns out, this is data that's fresh from C.B. Richard Ellis about what's happening in terms of population changes around the country during the pandemic. And what's interesting is the answer to the question sort of depends on where you are. If you're Philadelphia, the answer is not so bad. If you're San Francisco, there's work to do. So basically, the cities on the right, the more expensive cities in the country, are losing some population. But what's interesting is they're not necessarily losing population to the suburbs. They're losing population to other cities, in often smaller and more affordable cities, Philadelphia being one of them. And so it's an interesting moment for a city like Philly in terms of how it could kind of seize upon that and sort of see a kind of change to its tax base, but also, some of the things that make Philadelphia attractive. And so this question of attracting human capital was a question long before the pandemic. But I think that the pandemic has, I think of it as a kind of a foreshadowing of what is to come with climate change. All the inequitable aspects of the pandemic and a lot of the things we see now coming out of Washington in terms of trying to create more equity. And so, what do cities have to do to attract human capital? And I would argue that they need to focus on kind of the 4 E's in order to get to the 3 J's on this diagram. So a thriving economy is very important. Equity in terms of how people live, ecology in terms of sustainability, and one you hear about less, but one that I'm very focused on as an architect, and I'll explain why, is experience. Because you can have the other 3, but if it's some kind of technocratic experience, I don't think it satisfies the soul. And the idea is that with those as major policy goals, you could get to jobs, justice, and joy, which I think are the things that a lot of people are looking for from their communities today, particularly young people. So let's talk about why we're not there yet in terms of jobs, justice, and joy. And I'm going to pick on one aspect of the urban environment a bit today, which is the use of cars. Um, so we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and we've lost almost 3 million people that we know of to COVID-19. And that's a tragedy to lose that many people in a year globally, but we lose about 1.3 million people annually in road injuries. Um, and this dramatically impacts, obviously, issues of equity and experience as well as ecology. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of young people gravitating towards the lower bar of using mass transit in order to gain time with their family and friends, and also to avoid all of the problems of driving in cities. Road rage, texting while driving, drinking while driving, and horrible traffic. There are also big equity concerns around using cars in cities. We have data now that says where there is the intensity of traffic, which is the blue on this diagram, is also where there's the intensity of kind of low-income population, respiratory illnesses like childhood asthma. So there's a lot of equity issues with suburban commuters coming through these communities to get to inner city destinations. There's a lot of issues with driving and obesity and other health issues. There is even a Swedish study that says that absence doesn't make the heart grow fonder. In fact, it makes it break, with commute times more than 45 minutes, resulting in higher incidences of divorce. And then there's, of course, carbon emissions. And it's interesting, in this country today, we talk so much about a rural-urban divide, but one of the things that the rural and the urban, what I like to call the urban, share in common is a low carbon emission footprint per capita, meaning per person, actually, inner cities and rural areas use similarly low amounts of carbon. It's when you get out into the suburbs with their car dependency, with the single family homes, which are really terrible thermal envelopes, that you start to see carbon emissions skyrocket. And so this is actually some academic work from friends of mine here at Berkeley, colleagues who worked on the IPCC report, which won the Nobel in terms of its work on climate change. And what's interesting is we focus on all sorts of things when it comes to sustainability: electric cars, diets, trash. What they found is that the support for urban infill and densification is probably the biggest thing that most municipalities can do in terms of lowering per person carbon emissions. And so that was, to me, a very interesting finding coming from people who weren't architects or urban planners. And also that we should beware of silver bullets. Like electric cars, they're terrific, they have their place in the world, but they don't make this form of land use sustainable, actually. You can't bootstrap this new technology onto these old living patterns and imagine that they're still going to work somehow, because of all the other pertinent issues in terms of irrigating deserts and land erosion and all sorts of other sustainability issues that come with sprawl. Also in terms of technology, so for instance, we heard that rideshare services like Uber and Lyft were going to sort of save the day. In New York, we actually saw this huge uptick in traffic after 2017 with the adoption of ride services. And then there's just the fundamental fact of how large a car is, regardless of whether it's Uber or Lyft or electric. You see here how many people 50 people take up, how much space 50 people take up on the upper left. People in bikes, people on buses in the lower left, and then the lower right, 50 people in cars. And so there's a street equity problem with cars because of the amount of space they take up. And this has had this extraordinarily corrosive effect on every major city in the United States, including Philadelphia, in terms of loss of density, loss of mixed use and affordable housing, to parking and roadway infrastructure. It's a kind of car decay, like tooth decay. And that has to do, again, with scale. This is a stunning image to me. These two images are at scale. So the image on the left is a highway interchange in Los Angeles that is literally the same size as the historic quarter in Florence. And so what you notice about the image on the right is that it still has streets. Streets have been around millennia. Streets were invented well before cars, because streets were invented for people. It's only in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, when three big technological advances came at once: the invention of the elevator, the invention of structural steel, and the invention of the internal combustion engine, that you saw this massive transformation in how we thought about the city. And you saw cities that worked quite well in the pre-industrial era, up on the upper part of the slide. And then suddenly these larger buildings resulting from these larger technologies kind of shoehorning into 19th century fabric. Architects, of course, respond to this. Le Corbusier says, tear down much of inner city Paris to build towers and parks and, of course, highways. In the United States, this manifests in a very particular way after the work of Catherine Bauer and others in terms of creating public housing. But then we see the mismanagement of public housing. This is, of course, the famous, iconic image of Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, destroyed in the 1970s, built as a kind of utopian housing project. And what's interesting is, the right wing of the political spectrum says, see, this is why you can't do public investment, it fails. The left wing criticized this as warehousing the poor, criticized the architecture as a failure of modern architecture. The truth is, neither of those things are true. If you go back and watch this great documentary called The Pruitt-Igoe Myth, made by residents, interviewing residents of the original Pruitt-Igoe, they will tell you actually that originally it was a utopian place. It was middle class, it was mixed income and mixed race. The St. Louis Housing Authority takes on a bunch of policies that are quite racist, quite misogynist, that lead to the destruction of Pruitt-Igoe through its mismanagement. So it's really neither of the kind of legitimate, or excuse me, the typical criticisms that we hear of public housing. And it's interesting today that public housing may come back as a force, but the reason I go through that history is because we had kind of two kinds of issues going on in post-war America. We had both an arms race and a segregation battle over race happening simultaneously that led to the biggest infrastructure act this country's ever passed, the Federal Highway Act, which was built to move around intercontinental ballistic missiles, but also kind of was purposely designed to create what's known as white flight, as white Americans left cities like Philadelphia for the suburbs during that period. And we still live with many legacies. So it's interesting, all this hand-wringing around the trillions of dollars that President Biden is proposing in the infrastructure package. We spend extraordinary amounts of money subsidizing road-based transit as opposed to mass transit, subsidizing fossil fuels as opposed to renewables. And of course, in terms of climate change, this has led to this extraordinary precarity of the fact that we are, on a path to raise the planet's temperature over 2 degrees Celsius, with almost cataclysmic effects guaranteed if that happens. Could go to 4 degrees, in which case our species is in very serious trouble. So we have to stop using all of these fossil fuels. And yes, technology will play a role in that. Electric cars, sure, but if you're plugging your electric car into a coal-fired grid, you're just transferring the problem. So lifestyle has to come in tandem with technology in terms of changes to how we live. And there are lessons to be learned. This is a typical Japanese farming village, very different than the Jeffersonian ideal of a farmer living out on his or her land, but rather they living together in a cluster, far more sustainable, far more social. And we've seen around the world about 2 billion people enter the middle class. My friend Tom Campanella, who teaches up at Cornell, took this picture standing by my side in 1993 in Shanghai. And that is what that image looks like today. And if you've traveled through India or Turkey or Brazil, you'll know that this is happening all around the world. And in many places, they're building densely in terms of density on top of mass transit, particularly in East Asia. But that's not what we've been doing. We've been building lots and lots of sprawl, and there is sprawl being built around the world to cataclysmic effect, particularly here in California, but increasingly around the world. And so when we build new habitation, and we do have to build more habitation, we have 7 billion people on the planet today. There will be 11 billion by 2100. Those people have a right to live in great environments. And so rather than build sprawl, and rather than build really horrible environments, we have to look at, well, where do people naturally gravitate? You know, sure, Spanish Steps in Rome, but also tight-knit streets in Shanghai or Tokyo or Fez or the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. Again, these are both rich and poor places, but what they have in common is they were designed without the automobile in mind, but actually with the human in mind. But that's not what we're building. It's not the kinds of environments we're building. We're building, this is 6 continents around the world, all sorts of sprawl, but also really banal cities. These are 6 downtowns around the world. And I think a lot of us have noticed that with new urban growth, it feels like the same Starbucks, the same glass tower. And I think that's really problematic in terms of that experience issue that I was talking about earlier. A lot of that is because building today is largely standardized through capitalism. There's global building materials that we use so they don't evoke the local. So we have this dilemma. We know we need to build more dense circumstances for people, and we know that when people live with more mass transit and in apartments, they use much less carbon per person. But at the same time, we can't create soul-crushing environments that look like this. And so we need to start over, I think, in terms of how we build our urban environments. And there's clues in terms of what's happening now in terms of the pandemic. First of all, we've seen the death of the office park. These ideas of segregated uses, suburban subdivisions, office parks, shopping malls, highways in between. This is not the future. In Barcelona, 30% of people walk to work. They're trying to up that number to 50%, and it's interesting why. They not only want to up that number because it's good for people to walk in terms of their health, it's good in terms of sustainability, but they use this term that roughly translates as human speed, that there's this idea of a joy in walking because it is a more contemplative act, that people actually innovate more in that kind of circumstance. And to me, that is what urbanity is. Urbanity to me isn't about huge cities versus small towns. It is about places that have this common ingredient where someone who's different, a Greek city planner, Doxiades, talked about this in terms of the blue people and the red people well before our political divide. But the idea that every once in a while someone's born who thinks differently than the people around them. And they feel somewhat isolated, they don't feel part of a community until they get into denser circumstances and they find other people like them. And what's extraordinary about that is there's a certain contagion about their energy, that they start innovating and they start changing society itself. This could be a diagram of the Arab Spring or the BLM movement. It is the way in which people create change in society, and I would argue that cities are a fundamental part of that. We also know in terms of economy and jobs that as people are in more proximate circumstances, they innovate more. There are more patent creations. And so this term innovation district has become a bit of a buzzword, but it has a relevance in terms of this notion of serendipity, of people running into each other and creating ideas together. And I think as we move into the future, we have to think about how that works for everybody, and inclusivity being central to that in terms of whether it's disability rights or transgender rights, how everyone feels a sense of belonging in the environments that we create. And again, I would argue cars really inhibit that. So this is a typical side street in New York City. Note the cars, note how much space they take up. Note how much we take this environment for granted, as if these cars have some God-given right to use up that amount of space in our public streets. Note the garbage on the street because there's not enough space to handle them properly. So this is a project we did with the New York Times editorial board, an advocacy project that we called NYC or Not Your Car, that imagined if we banned private vehicles, not all vehicles, so there'd still be buses and Access-a-Ride for the disabled and freight delivery and so forth, and shared vehicles like taxis, there wouldn't be private cars. Imagine, because Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, is doing this right now to great effect. So this may not be so fanciful for a city like Philadelphia. And what we tried to illustrate is that if you got rid of the private cars, there's more room for seniors, there's more room for children, there's more room to properly manage solid waste, to get deliveries, to have bike lanes, and just a more equitable environment. And so this is up in Harlem, a legendary neighborhood, of course, but with a tremendous amount of asphalt, 125th Street. Imagine what communities could do in terms of community participation, in terms of deciding, do they want more green grocers here? Do they want homeless services? Do they want bioswales to retain stormwater? There's a whole menu of things that could happen once this space is recovered for people. And so I think one thing technology does promise, if for instance we get more autonomous vehicles or just fewer cars, that the space that we give over to cars, the diagram on the left, could form 21st century courtyard environments. And our office has been doing a lot of prototyping with this about what these environments could look like if they were predominantly pedestrian, could use far more sustainable materials like cross-laminated timber, which is a carbon sink, could have weather mitigated public space for use during shoulder seasons, and could just be, could be a denser environment that people actually want to be in as opposed to the kind of rejection we see today of density. Equity is a huge part of that. And one of the things when you talk about walkable environments or bikeable environments is that they are also the more expensive environments we're seeing. And so, this is just showing that with more walkability comes more expense. And we have lost a huge amount of affordable housing in this country and since World War II. And so in my 2013 book, I talked about redirecting a lot of the federal subsidies that go to wealthy people, for instance, people who own $1 million homes and get mortgage interest deductions for no good reason. The UK and the Netherlands took them away. Real estate markets were fine. Redirected that money towards affordable housing, towards cultural institutions, towards sustainability, towards infrastructure. And I called it in my book the American Smart Infrastructure Act, or ASIA for short, which was a hint. And this idea that it's nice to see the White House talk about now, which is a broader definition of infrastructure, an infrastructure of opportunity that creates social mobility through these kinds of investments. And that could then apply in a territory of the city that's changing. When you think about Schuylkill Yards or the Navy Yard and other parts of Philly, we are moving away from a central business district model in our cities because technology is enabling different parts of our cities to be places where people work, live, and play. And what many of us are talking about, the mayor of Paris included, is the notion that within a short walk, you could reach 80% of your daily needs. And what's interesting is if you talk to the urban citizens about density, they tend to be apprehensive. If you say to urban citizens, would you like most of your daily needs within a short walk? Everyone says yes. And then you say, well, actually you need density and mixed use, as Jane Jacobs talked about, in order to achieve that. So it becomes a different conversation. And then I think architecture plays a critical role. How buildings open up, particularly on their ground floor, and plug into these infrastructures to us is incredibly important as architects. And so I'm going to close these last few minutes just by talking about a couple of projects that we're working on as examples of kind of the case I just tried to make to you all. So this is in Detroit. We're working for Ford Motor Company, ironically, given the talk I just gave you, because they are moving into becoming a mobility company. And this building, which was designed by the same architects as Grand Central Station in New York, Warren and Whitmore, is the center of a new master plan we're working on with them. This station was abandoned in the 1980s. Ford bought it. It's surrounded by all sorts of asphalt and emptiness, and there are communities, but the communities feel disconnected from this building. And so we're working on a plan with the community, with Ford, to see how this old train station can become a magnet, a locus for new activity, not just with a series of new buildings where people could live or work and innovate, but also with a whole network of public spaces, a landscape architecture designed by my colleague Mick Young Kim in Boston. And one of the things, I worked on the High Line early on in New York after 9/11, and I really believe in a very intense focus on the existing. And Philly is filled with things like this, where there are existing infrastructures that can be reused. There's embodied energy, there's history, there's a sense of identity in these places, but they become downtrodden. And so this is just showing you some before and afters of taking the old train platform, some of which will be used for train use, but not all, and turning it into public space that's accessible to everyone with bike lanes and so forth. This is the upper level view of that same space, where you see kind of, again, a future public space. We did this successfully at Domino. I've been working on this site for about 10 years now, and we're now the architects for that old sugar refinery, which is a landmark building in New York City. So we worked on the master plan with landscape architects, one of your local great firms, James Corner Field Operations, on the design for this master plan in this park. This place was not a park. It was shut off from the community. The sugar refinery moved to upstate New York, and so it's wonderful to see people. There's a lot of different, very diverse communities, both racially and socioeconomically, that live near this park. It's great to see their kids playing together in the park. And the building becomes also a new hub, like that building in Michigan, in Detroit, where, one of the first sketches I did was about inserting this new structure into the old building. This is what the old building looked like. This is how you refine sugar. Refined sugar is disgusting, by the way. I suggest you don't eat it after you know the processes for making it. But the equipment was held back from the facade, and so we are inserting this new building, much like that old equipment was, back from the original brick facade. So this is inside the building, but outdoors. It'll rain and snow in this space. And so this is the kind of diagram that is becoming this. This is under construction right now. And this is a new creative office building with a very public ground floor that's meant to be the new epicenter of this place. This passed almost unanimously in our Landmarks Commission. And I think those kinds of processes are incredibly important in terms of how a democracy functions. This also went through a major public rezoning with the community, with 6.5 acres of new waterfront public space. And again, the ground floor, the openness, we had fun doing this drawing. It took us about a week to show the notion of this porosity of this big muscular building coming down in this very delicate, beautiful landscape. Beth mentioned Mongolia. This is the coldest capital in the world. And in the heart of the capital, there's an amusement park, and the amusement park is our client. And they have this 12-acre piece of land next to the amusement park, right in central Ulaanbaatar. We struggle with urbanity. We're a nomadic people. And so we talked about this idea of what the French call the flaneur, the urban nomad, of creating a space in which one could get lost, basically, and have that notion of wandering through the city. And we wanted to do something that was very, very precisely local and looked very much at the color palette, which is just extraordinarily beautiful, and picked local colors that evoked that color palette. The Mongolians actually tend to build quite colorful buildings. And these are all relatively low scale. It's a mix of office, apartment, shops, a folk theater, an observation tower. There's very few pedestrian places in downtown Ulaanbaatar. It's a Soviet city. You see the Ferris wheel of the amusement park in the background. And it's meant to be highly sustainable in terms of how it captures heat in the wintertime, and a potential geothermal exchange for heating it and so forth. But to me, one of the most important aspects is not one of these developments that's just a bunch of blue glass towers that you see everywhere, but something that is intensely local in terms of construction technology and identity and experience. Then to Bentonville, Arkansas. This is an affordable housing project, a competition we won using very, very low cost materials in a single family neighborhood to create a scale that was reminiscent of the single family neighborhood, and using code to understand how we could not build one of those anonymous elevator buildings and still have handicapped access to the ground floor units, and still have cars, but in again, a walkable, bikeable community. Last couple of projects here, just in East New York, one of the poorest parts of New York City, for a pastor who runs the Christian Cultural Center. This congregation, which is about 30,000 strong, extraordinary group of people, lost about 110 people to COVID. So, this is, again, these unequal impacts that have happened around our cities. That's a Tower in the Park housing project behind it that's incredibly successful and stable. It's a middle-class housing complex. And so the pastor at Red as Jane Jacobs wanted a place that people would naturally come, wanted a cultural center and a school, as well as about 2,000 units of all affordable housing. So this is 100% social housing, including supportive homeless housing for formerly homeless. But again, some of these same ideas about streets and shared streets. Local council member wanted brick, wanted different scales of housing. You see the Performing Arts Center off in the distance there. Um, and just, I think places of gathering are incredibly important in Cleveland. So I think you're getting a pattern of where we like to work, which are places where cities, that are on the recovery from the post-industrial period. We just won this competition to expand the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I.M. Pei's building in Cleveland. This building is so important to Cleveland and a real cultural center. And so this isn't the final design yet, but we're working on this new magnet, again, just like the building in Ford and in Domino, to really create a cultural heart for Cleveland. And then I just wanted to close with Schuylkill Yards. Some of you may have read about this. We got a great review from Inga Saffron about these. This is the beginnings of Schuylkill Yards. I think you've seen what's happened with the Bolton building. You see 30th Street Station off to the right there. And again, this notion of creating transit-oriented density. This is a knowledge-based development in terms of the kinds of companies that want to move here, create jobs, go in the life sciences. A lot of very interesting interactions with the community again. And I have to say, a really great process with your Civic Design Review Commission. So the origins of the design, we did an intense study of Philadelphia's heritage, its material qualities, everything from your earliest buildings to Frank Furness to Lou Kahn and I.M. Pei and some of your more modern buildings. And what was interesting, part of the inspiration for this building were the red trains that used to run through Schuylkill Yards, the need obviously for modern glass, but then Frank Furness and the use of arches of terracotta. So the building actually will have terracotta at its base. And then if you read the Saffron piece, it was all about sort of having fun with the architecture. It's hard to think about having fun with an office building, but the whole idea was we had these office floor plate sizes that the client needed. We had a certain zoning envelope. And we tried to create a building that was sort of like a tumbling set of kids' blocks, that if you turn the building on its end, it would still be the same form, with these cantilevers, one that pointed at the station, one that pointed at College Walk towards Drexel and UPenn. And so the building kind of changes from whatever direction you see it, creates a new public space underneath the rail viaduct between the two buildings. The building on the left is a residential building with, again, sort of life science and lab space below. And did a lot of environmental studies about wind, because Schuylkill Yard's a bit windy, breaking up the massing from the street, bringing green and biophilia into the building. And always these intense studies we do of the ground floor, that big arcade that will invite people again in, again, a kind of terracotta. So wherever the human being gets close to it, you see this red terracotta with this very interesting polychromatic paint above that kind of shifts in the light and shifts as you move around. So I'm just going to close by saying I really believe the future, especially in this post-pandemic moment, is about rail-based habitation with this kind of sense that if you really love nature, don't try to live in it, but actually, live in more compact circumstances. You'll be able to get out into nature to go camping and take trains and so forth more easily. And that if we do that, that the city, along with new technologies, is the last and best hope we have for addressing climate change inequities and creating a more joyful culture and experience of the world. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Vishaan. This is just fascinating, fascinating. I'm writing down lots of questions, and I hope all of you were too. Please put them in the Q&A. Right now we have Toaster notes that when they lived in San Francisco, the first thing techies did was turn 3 flats rentals into single-family homes and excavated the basements for the 2-car garage for their electric cars. And that what they see being created is expensive vertical suburbs. The middle and working class gets pushed out of walkable city neighborhoods, which Philadelphia did first with Society Hill, which gets to your point. You said the more walkability, the higher the cost of housing. So I think maybe this brings a question for you: is how in your practice are you addressing those issues so that walkability does not equal inaccessibility for, as you're talking about economic justice in the city?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things here. First of all, I think it is a good trend that people, if you think about the American dream, which did not start with this notion of a house and a car. It actually started with this idea in the 1930s. James Truslow Adams wrote about it, about equal opportunity for every man and woman in the country. And he wrote about this as the American dream. That shifted in the post-war era to this idea of the house and the car. And of course, consumerism and capitalism drove all of that. Today, we're seeing more people not reject that and want more walkable circumstances, which is what's creating all the tremendous housing pressure. And so, the comment about vertical suburbs is well taken, which is why we need much more aggressive policy towards creating affordable housing and social housing in our cities. It's not the density that's the problem. The problem is the financial model that undergirds the density. And this is why I so went out of my way to show Pruitt-Igoe that we used to have a very different idea about this. But today, the federal government it's actually illegal since 1986 for the federal government to finance, urban public housing. And so we do see a lot of luxury development going up. And I don't think there's anything wrong with market rate housing in cities. I just think it has to be balanced with affordable housing. There was a famous mayor from Latin America, and I'm going to paraphrase, but he basically said, a successful place, it shouldn't be about poor people driving cars, it should be about rich people taking mass transit. And really, it's about everyone taking mass transit. So, part of the issue with this rich versus poor thing that's developed in our cities is we don't want rich people living out in Bucks County in 10,000 square foot homes with 5 cars in their garage. That's terrible for the environment. And in fact, those people use more carbon per person than almost anyone else in the world, except for some people in the United Arab Emirates. So we want those people in our cities using mass transit. It's just there has to be the balance of that with the middle class and with the working class and with the working poor. And that's the problem that we have, that in a market-based economy, that totally got away from us. And it's about pulling all of that together in a way that creates truly mixed income environments that I think is essential.
Thank you. So one of our attendees said, your design seems so accessible, yet on the Schuylkill Yards Tower, there are park areas which look like they're 3 steps up from the ground. And if you explain that, if they're...
Sure. Everything is accessible to wheelchairs, to people who are using canes and so forth. We go out of our way to make sure that we're going above what the American Disabilities Act says in terms of what you have to provide, which is obviously universal access. That just happened to be that one view.
And Sadell is curious about the status of this terracotta accented building at the Schuylkill Yards. Has ground been broken? Do we have any idea when it might?
They are moving forward on the residential tower, which there's more demand for the residential right now. But we're very hopeful. Brandywine is a terrific client. We're very hopeful about the office space, and especially around, again, like I said, knowledge-based companies that obviously benefit from the eds and meds in West Philadelphia.
Well, Eileen shares all of this. I think so. This has been a fascinating talk. I'm going to do this, and I'll get to some questions. But she says, welcome to Philly and your work here. I'm looking forward to watching Schuylkill Yards come to life. And I'll add to that. I think we all hope that if you or your team are in town doing work, that you feel welcome to come by the Athenaeum to, dive into our architectural archives and take a refreshment in our, in our space.
We would love to. We would love to. I haven't been to Philly in a year and change, so I miss it.
And so I think, so one of the questions I have as you're keeping the pulse on what's happening out there also, we've noticed in Philadelphia that during the pandemics, we were able to get lots of streets closed off to open up outdoor dining. And there's been a lot of, are we going to be allowed to continue this, or are the streets going to be reopened again? Are you seeing an increased hunger through the pandemic for making more walkable, pedestrian-friendly, mixed-use friendly streets without cars? And our cities actually responding to that?
Yes, when I worked for city government after 9/11, I worked with a wonderful commissioner of our Department of Transportation, Jeanette Sadiq-Khan, and she was the one who brilliantly devised this notion of the temporary becoming the permanent. Or, well, I don't know if she invented it, but she certainly took advantage of it. And you saw, so Times Square, which started as a kind of makeshift pedestrian plaza and now is a much more permanent pedestrian plaza. I think it's wonderful what's going on with all these outdoor restaurants. There are going to be issues. There have already been incidents with like a car hitting and again, this friction with cars and cars going too fast in our cities and so. And I'm about to embark on a cross-country trip towing an Airstream. I think that kind of driving is fantastic, but let's not confuse Thelma and Louise with 2 hours sitting in traffic in Atlanta. And we have this real conflict that's brewing. And so the outdoor restaurants, we're going to probably have to put some safety standards around them to make sure that people are safe when they're eating. And hopefully those safety standards won't be concrete barriers, right? But something that we actually design in our environments. But the right answer is just fewer and fewer private vehicles in our streets so that things like those outdoor restaurants can flourish.
Great, thank you. Marjorie is wondering what your suggestions are for below ground areas. I'm guessing she suggests if there's a way that we can make use of below ground areas in urban design.
That's a super interesting question. The thing that immediately comes to mind is in Rotterdam, which is very flood prone. A lot of the below ground parking garages are used to store flood water. So in other words, huge rainstorm, the parking garage. Can you imagine? I can't even imagine something like this in the United States. I mean, I can imagine. I just can't imagine people being so thoughtful. They designed the parking garage as a water holding tank so that the city streets don't flood. And I was actually in this PBS documentary called Promise or Peril, and I was interviewed about New York's resilience. But what was fascinating is I learned all this stuff about Tokyo's. And Tokyo apparently years ago, leave it to the Japanese, built 5 concrete underground retention tanks that are the height of the Eiffel Tower to hold stormwater and floodwater. So I think that's a great use. I showed that geothermal diagram with the Mongolia project. Philadelphia is actually a really good climate for geothermal exchange. So there's a lot of good things we can do with the underground that can aid us in sustainability.
And I guess when we talk about sustainability, Lee is also asking, is there anything that could be being done to make solar or wind power visually more attractive? So maybe it'll be more integrated into our cities.
Yeah, no, great question. So Tesla obviously now has the roof shingle. So there are now shingles that are designed for
Mm.
suburban homes that look like ordinary roof shingles. Um, what all of our universities are researching in different ways are transparent solar cells. They exist, they're just very expensive, which means that, I mean, imagine if Comcast Tower, like if all of those windows were solar, right? And you could still see through them, but they were solar. The entire building becomes a battery. So that's super interesting. I actually really like the look of the wind turbines. There are some bird problems with both bird glass and wind turbines, which obviously that's a big issue. But I don't like all these hoity-toity objections about wind turbines. I mean, we are in the middle of a climate crisis. People have to get over it. The bird problem, that's a real problem. The fact that people think that they spoil view, I mean, I just think we have to get over it. Like, it's really, really important.
I guess we could think, like maybe it's a different feeling when people see them off the coast, but like in California, when you're, driving, driving on I-5, and you see, the turbines out there in the
Yeah,
just in the hills and
and
stuff.
they're
It is
gorgeous, I think,
really,
actually. It's really
yeah,
stunning.
they're very
You know?
beautiful there.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe it depends on where people see them, their context, whether or not
Right.
they like them. Stephen is asking, what can architecture offer towards reducing urban conflict and violence? This is interesting, especially that which seems perhaps ironically to derive from strong identity with the city, or more specifically, a few blocks within the city.
What a great and well-worded question. Couple of thoughts. When obviously there's a lot of examples of public space in the presentation, and I really believe in that notion of public space as a social condenser, and write a lot about this notion of what I call positive social friction. The notion that, cars segregate us, but in cities, when we are confronted with each other on a bus or a subway or in a public park and see that person that looks different from us, right? I think what reduces urban conflict is the notion that when that person comes face to face with someone that looks different than us, practices a different religion, is of a different skin color, has different religious dress on, whatever it might be, that person isn't as scary in real life as Fox News makes them out to be. In fact, they're not scary in the slightest. And that park I showed in Domino is a great example of this, where there's at least 4 or 5 major ethnic communities that live around that park. And just seeing their kids play together, I think that over generations reduces urban conflict. But Stephen also asked the second part of that question, which is if you focus on identity, right, you make a building that's Philadelphian. My interpretation of his question is, does that increase tribalism? Right? And actually, the whole reason that architecture went into this whole modern universalist idea was this notion of reducing tribalism, which didn't work out all that well in a lot of ways. Um, but I take the point, and that's why I think tradition and identity need to be observed, but not slavishly, and that there needs to be room for interpretation, and I think that's really critical.
Thank you. One of our attendees asks, one of the problems Philly faces is the lack of information-based jobs. Google and Facebook, for example, are not moving here. So despite world-class colleges, we don't seem to attract high-level employees or employers, and wondering how urban design can change that.
It's so interesting because, of course, most progressive San Franciscans are happy to see tech companies go. There's been so much heat around that topic here. Not enough light, because San Francisco hasn't been producing housing, and progressive communities have often used kind of Jane Jacobs tactics to fight new housing, even affordable housing. That's also happening in New York City. Um, and when they do that, they of course constrain housing supply, which in turn will make housing prices go up. And so part of the question of inviting tech companies to come to cities like Philly is what's attractive, I think, for a lot of people about Philly is they get a great urban lifestyle at a demonstrably lower price than New York or San Francisco. And to me, the key is you have to be careful what you wish for in the question, because some tech company, some set of companies will make that discovery. And I think life sciences is actually already starting to drive some of this in Philadelphia. The question is going to be, as that really starts happening, how can you make sure that you're drawing on federal funds and local funds and state funds to build enough affordable housing to balance out? And by the way, it's not just building, it's also tenant protections and existing housing to make sure that you stabilize your population and don't have displacement from gentrification.
That I think this is so interesting. I mean, in some ways, it depends on our worldview that sometimes the architecture can solve all our problems, right? And as you sort of pointed out, there's so many actors that need to work together to to help make it work. Do you see? You're out there in Berkeley, and know BART is constantly under fire. Will it be able to survive? Can they Marin County doesn't want BART to go through because they're afraid of who might be coming through their county. Philadelphia, we struggle with SEPTA, and do we charge more? How do we what do we do with our services? How do we create a stronger will and support for public transportation, which is, as I said, is vital for
don't follow the Bay Area model. I mean, to say that BART is under fire, you use the word fire very judiciously out here. This region is a hot mess. This region is a hot mess. On the west, you saw last year the Red Sky Day. You saw everything on fire, basically across the Western time zone. We built 32 million homes in the urban wildland interface. And everyone out here wants to just blame it on big oil and the Koch brothers as if their lifestyles have nothing whatsoever to do with the fact that there's running electrical lines out in the woods. And that has to do with your mass transit question, because you can't be allergic to mass transit if you want a sustainable environment, full stop. And so your question about SEPTA, I mean, SEPTA should be free. Mass transit should be free. Like libraries, it should be something that we encourage people to use. So much of the strife that was happening in Chile a year and a half ago was around raising transit fares when the wealthy drive. And so we just need to tax roadways, we need to tax cars. Our fuel consumption tax is ridiculously low. In today's dollars, it's in $1970. Right, what we charge for fuel. Economists say that if you just brought gas taxes up with inflation, gas would be about $10 a gallon right now. And of course, you have to make some compensation for people who have to drive. But most people don't have to drive in cities, and so we can use that money to strengthen our mass transit system, make it free, but also not just rely on our rail systems, which are that hub and spoke central business district model, but take cars off the streets. So buses, rubber tire technology, zero emission rubber tire technology, electric buses can run in a network and in a horizontal pattern all over the city, as opposed to everyone having to come in and out of the central business district.
Yeah.
That's the future. That's what Paris is doing. That's what smart cities are going to be doing around the world.
Well, Paris has always been in the lead, so as cities go. So maybe we'll.
This mayor, she's my hero. I mean, Paris actually was very auto-dominated just about a decade ago. She's been extraordinary, and she's really. It's tough politically to take on cars, because cars are not ideological. There's just people on all ends of the political spectrum that just love their car.
Well, this has just been so wonderful. As you can see from the questions that folks have asked, we've so enjoyed this. We will be making your talk available on our YouTube. So if you want to share it with anybody, please do. And if folks who were not able to attend will also receive a copy of this. we're so grateful. Want to ask just one more question before we finish. Is there any reading? Any our folks love to check out books from our library and keep up. Is there anything that you would encourage people to read as they think about these topics?
Oh, sure. There's a great book called The Great Inversion, which is about how we now have increasing suburban poverty because our cities have gentrified so much, and what a huge problem that is. I really like, I'm just getting through The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, which talks
Mm-hmm.
about racial politics in the United States, and I think takes a very particular tack, including thinking about our cities, and look, I will forever read the Obama books, but anyway, that's just a couple. I'll if I think of more, I'll email some suggestions. So
Thank you so much, and we'll let you all know. Make sure if we have these in our library. Know we have a couple of them, and we'll send it out to everybody when we send out the link to the show. Tess, do you have the upcoming? I forgot my brochure at downstairs. Here we go. Thank you. Few more things coming up. Our Tuesday in the collections this next week, Collections of the Mind, understanding the history of phrenology through items in our collection. Next week, we also have our evening program will be Mark Edmondson about his new book, Walt Whitman Invents America. And then May 18th, another perennial favorite, Charles Duff, North Atlantic Cities. He was going to be speaking here a year ago, and we had to keep rescheduling. So we're delighted he will be here with